So, Eleanor, great to have you with us this afternoon, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Eleanor is our professor. Professor Doyle is an esteemed alumnus of the IMCA now at this point, as she's one of our academic fellows, one of those rare folks that we occasionally kind of honor and bestow the accreditation to through the international body and that orientation. And indeed, as part of that, she so very kindly offered to just share her thoughts in terms of the as is and perhaps have a fireside chat module here with us this afternoon in regard to management consultancy and the practice of it. Eleanor is or was the Vice Dean for Internationalization, although she's handed that over now. She's done her tour and external engagement at Cork University, the Cubs, as it's more kind of parochially known. She's also, I think, a member of the International Microeconomics MOC network over in Harvard, Eleanor's, I think it is, who is led by the famous Professor Michael Porter, of whom we all would have a copy of his books under our pillows for bedtime reading. She co-chairs the Knowledge Generation Council of that network and organizes its annual presentation of research at the HBS, which again, the Harvard Business School needs no introduction, nor does Cubs. So very much kind of in the zeitgeist of that particular spectrum and very much aware of the industry in terms of practitioner-led stuff, where she leads I suppose, the Cubs practitioner-oriented doctoral research program, which the DBA, which is interest to some of our colleagues in that space, and some of them indeed are actually progressing their interest in that area across the various spectrum of the 23 organizations that we cover. She's, I think, Eleanor, it's fair to say that you've probably done the guts of 20 doctoral theses in that particular area at this point. So I don't want to gild the lily. Your CV is very long and very eminent, and there's a lot of ground covered and a lot of academic, storied academic kind of process built in there over the years. So Gurmila Mahagat Akara for coming with us along the journey this afternoon. We're really looking forward to it. Again, the Institute, as I say, accredits a significant proportion of the third level, master's level courses across the country in MBAs and related entities that are involved in the practice and profession of management consultancy. So I would say you're all welcome to join. We're recording this module, and we will send it out to participants who might have had the opportunity to log on here this afternoon, and we'll also put it up on our various social media sites. But just for the avoidance of doubt, it is being recorded, and from a GDPR point of view and so forth, if anyone has any issues with that, feel free to step off now, or forevermore hold your peace. So on that basis, we'll take it out as I always say, it's not me you're here to see, it's more Eleanor you're here to listen to. And perhaps, Eleanor, I suppose, just to kind of get the rubber hitting the road, if I was to ask you, I suppose, in your experience, and you've seen a lot of action in this particular space and the evolution, we were talking a little bit about it earlier in terms of, the Uber trends that you see coming along, artificial intelligence is hot to trot at the moment and whatever it'll be next year and so on. And there's huge opportunities. But if you maybe look at real world alignment and that kind of you operate kind of in a very interesting space where you kind of walk in both worlds in terms of the practitioner space as well. I mean, could you maybe, share your thoughts on how you see companies or organizations successfully align sustainability, which again is that Uber trend, but we're talking more about in terms of corporate sustainability, actually sustainability in terms of keeping the doors open, keeping the customers supplied, and actually being profitable in practical terms. And, maybe share some, in your experience, some standout examples or case studies that come to mind. I think sometimes we lose that kind of focus on bottom line sustainability over green sustainability, and without both, obviously, which are important in ESG and so forth and so on, we really, from a practitioner point of view, it's all about the bottom line and being profitable and kind of having a future in terms of the organization. So if I could pose that initial big question to you.
Yeah, yeah. And like we see that majorly now in our classrooms, whether it's with the undergrads all the way through to the MBAs and the doctoral people that you mentioned there. That balance, I suppose, my background is in economics first before I kind of went into the business strategy area. And I think that background in education and economics is very useful because it focuses the mind on bottom line issues and economic profitability, as opposed to accounting profitability, I guess, is kind of underlying your question somewhat. Because even that difference between economic and accounting profitability it argues you need more than an accounting profit to remain in business. There needs to be a proper and reasonable and fair return in the eyes of the owner of a business to remain in business. And I think that's quite a useful way of thinking about the profitability issue, because it's quite subjective too. You know, we can imagine in a small business what that means, that subjectivity about the person's time and literally your life and resource investment that can go into the business. You know, scale it up to the bigger commercial organizations. If their resources aren't being used to generate a profit, well, then it's likely that those resources should be better used in some alternative way. And that's our opportunity cost kind of story. So, you know, and that's all well and good. But the notion of short-term profit versus the long-term sustainability, I think, is where we've arrived now with a bit more intelligence, perhaps, than for a long time. We were talking about real-world alignment, and what resonated with me was an interesting case that I've come across. I tend to use it in a lot of my teaching with, you know, different focus for you know, depending on the group that I'm dealing with. But I think there's a lot that we can learn from looking at companies who have managed to align their profit focus, their economic sustainability, with any other legs of the sustainability stool, whether it's environment or whether it's social. And again, locally, you know, what I come across here, I think, is a focus on the environmental, probably more than the social. And what I wanted to throw out and share with you was one example of a financial services group called Discovery in South Africa. I don't know how widely known they are, but given how big they are, I'd say, you know, some people at least on the call are aware of them. But I had only latterly become aware of them through what else but a Harvard Business School case study. But it's interesting. They're really interesting for a number of reasons. They were founded in '92 as a health and insurance company. And even there, their foundations were health and insurance, not just, you know, the financial focus, but health as well. And over time, lovely, interesting story. You know, they've developed international partnerships, they've local, international, global expansion. They've failures in international. They failed to develop a foothold in the US, which, given the medical sector, is no surprise, I guess. But their stage one growth was developing business where they wanted to give their members incentives to reduce healthcare costs. So they set up a healthcare business. They launched using an interesting model, which has now become quite prevalent in South Africa, a medical savings plan approach. And you essentially can use whatever money is in your medical savings plan for your expenses. Certain expenses are covered, others are discretionary. And through their initial business, they managed to help their members to reduce their non-discretionary expenditure. And that's the type of expenditure which was out of pocket.
Okay.
And that was fine. They generated profit, but within a short period of time, their rationale for, you know, focusing on the health of their membership allowed them to think about not just pooling risk, as you always do in any insurance business, but to build up, and this kind of links into our discussion about AI that we were having earlier as well, or rather big data, I suppose. They decided that rather than just thinking in risk terms about their business, they wanted to leverage the access to health information that was possible at the time. And again, now, you know, it's horses for courses. What can be done is dependent on available technologies and so on. But they developed their business. Once their model was up and running, you know, they were open to imitation and competition and so on. So they knew they had to differentiate. And that's where when someone came to them with an offer to link up with a gym in 1997, that kind of allowed them to think, yes, we need to convert our information and set up a program that will allow people to understand at a personal level the impact of health and spending on health insurance. And they did that. So again, it's a nice story of kind of building in a behavioral change program with allowing customers, greater financial security, giving motivational incentives, giving money off vouchers, giving, money off for foods from health stores. They developed a really interesting product called Vitality. They were data-based. They, grounded all of their analysis on what would have the biggest impact on the health of the population. So, to some extent, it's kind of, you say these things as no-brainers, but, if you can reduce smoking, if you can reduce inactivity, if you can reduce alcohol consumption, if you can improve diet, all of those things actually have a meaningful impact on spending, on healthcare, and so on, but also on the longevity, on the general health costs in a population, and so on. And they found, they found by offering these different types of incentives and motivations that across the standard measures of health performance, they could help their membership to track their own behaviors and outcomes. And when they had access to all this data, they were able to prove, if you like, that there was not only a business model, but a societal impact model where there was no traditional trade-off. Again, I think in a lot of this area about sustainability, there's a lot of mindset type of debate that we are talking about a cost versus an investment.
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, they're mindset issues, really. Do I see something as a cost? Do I see it as an investment? Short term, long term. And I just really like the model as they developed it, because they used available technology, knowledge, international best practice in deciding how to best bring together their desire to improve the health of the population, offer insurance products, but ultimately make money from all of this, because without that ongoing profit, there's nothing to plow back, there's no development possible, there's no innovation possible.
Yeah.
And they really, really have a very interesting story of, as I say, failure in the US market. They just probably they didn't understand the market sufficiently, and so on. But they had success actually in the UK market.
All right.
With the Prudential Health there. And again, what we know about the UK NHS and the very small private health market, it's a particular, every economy, I guess, every society has its own medical type of setup. They had success in China and so on. And I string to their bow is that they partnered with Apple in 2015. Okay. So if you're in the Vitality program, you got a free Apple Watch. The data was collated, and again, I can use all of that hard data to assess the relationship between, changing behaviors, impacts on health, and then impacts on expenditures, requirements for health insurance, and all of this. Really, really interesting story.
That's a great story, and I have to say I hadn't heard of them. But funnily enough, as you mentioned that in a segue to the Irish Times, had an article yesterday where PD4, I think it was, you may have seen it. Were doing a remarkable, not unsimilar program with their members, where they were offering a health program for I think 130 a week, which was an amazing deal, and cutting the. I didn't go through it in great detail, but it's an interesting article. It's kind of not unsimilar to that program where you can get your medical interventions abroad on an as needs.
Yes.
Yeah, but they actually did one more locally and parochially in Northern Ireland, but reduced kind of the waiting times by a significant magnitude. But it just, when you were speaking about it, I just thought that an interesting example more locally, and although very parochial to their particular, I suppose, jurisdiction. But it goes back to that point, Eleanor, about no margin, no mission. If you can save the world, but if you can't actually sustain the actual mission in terms of, building in that integrity of process, that there is a kind of a future there, it can be all for naught. And I suppose to that point, it does come back, and we see a lot of that kind of element in terms of, that whole piece about that short-term reporting cycle that you speak of, which the markets have driven,
Yeah,
as opposed to that Japanese cycle, which is almost intergenerational, or you see that kind of more in the Middle East as well. It's an intergenerational investment cycle.
yeah,
I always remember that one of the sheiks, I think it was down in one of the race course, or the studs they bought down the country or whatever, and they were doing up the outbuildings and stuff like that, and they were concerned about budgetary implications, and they were choosing between two types of particular roof tile.
mm,
And when the sheik was asked for his opinion, they were given A and B, and A was fit for purpose, but might last 25, 30 years, but that would be the normal standard, and part L was achieved and all that good stuff. And the
yes,
other one was maybe something that could last like a blue banger a couple of 100 years, but maybe incrementally 4 or 5 times more expensive.
yeah,
And the decision was made to go with the long-term one, based on the fact that they were investing for the generations as yet unborn.
yeah.
So it's a different kind of mindset, I suppose, as opposed to your point about short-termism. And again, it does come back to that customer perception piece, and that whole impact. And we hear so much about greenwashing, for example, but if you were kind of maybe to think about it a little bit in terms of how, for example, when I think about it, the perceptions of customers' sustainability efforts in terms of how organizations go about their business,
Yeah.
um, and how that impacts, I suppose, their buying decisions, the actual choices that we are making. I mean, you can see that, for example, on packaging at the moment, and food particularly, and you've seen a huge evolution in that space more recently, and even down to that piece about kind of the recent introduction of the recycling laws with plastic bottles and so forth. But I mean, in your kind of, I suppose, through the prism of what you're seeing both academically and practically, can you maybe share some examples with us, where this perception piece, that consumer or customer or client perception piece, has significantly influenced strategic and tactical business outcomes?
Mm, mm. Um, God, I could say a lot there now, and I would nearly be sidetracked on the recycling story, but I won't go there. Um,
Sorry.
no, 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 it just takes up too much space in my head for what it's worth, really. But um, if we think in terms of customer perception, I think we're definitely beyond tipping point. For a while there again, it may have been possible to argue, with the head what customers should be buying, what we should be demanding, and so on. But I think when it comes now to going beyond what we think we should buy, but our actual purchasing pattern, there is, I think now, quite a bit of evidence that um, you can actually still be quite profitable while focusing on delivering the various types of sustainability again. And
Mm.
it's one of those kind of survey responses I would tend to track over time. And what always interests me is the gap between what people report in terms of, yes, sustainability matters to me when I make my purchases, but then a different question generates a lower, usually, response. Are you actually willing to pay more for the more sustainable? And that gap between those two responses, it's now about 80% of customers say that, yes, sustainability matters for their purchases. And now over half are reporting that they actually are willing to pay more. So that knowing what I should do and actually doing, so walking the talk as well as talking the talk, that gap has tended to be reduced over time. I think we can see it, we see it on the supermarket shelf in terms of the proportion of space given over to what for a long time I think were more expensive products, but I'm pleasantly surprised quite often now that a lot of the organic produce is actually no longer more expensive. So you can actually be sensible across the board in terms of making lots of your purchases. What I see coming through here from our younger students, though, is, and again, I don't know how perceptible this is in terms of the clients that you're working with, but I see a very big shift, a difference between my undergraduate students all the way through to masters, so that's a 18 to 22
Mm.
age group, and the discussions I might have, say, with my executive type classes. So would there be 10, 12 plus years of difference, probably in age between them? And I think there is a really obvious mindset shift, very evident in our student populations now. It's no longer one or the other. It's almost an assumption that sustainability is being built into what's being done. Not that
Okay.
it must, but it's almost assumed that that's the case. And I think if that's a gap that our businesses are unaware of, then they're probably more fearful of the changes that need to be made, that the younger people coming through are almost expecting. And I find that very interesting, that gap, and it gives me good food for discussion with the executive type audience, in terms of the value of going down the different types of sustainability routes honestly, making claims that make sense, and so on, because reputation is hugely important. Also, on the kind of analysis side of things, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that says different types of sustainability claims will get you more purchases in the market. So what I mean by that now is there doesn't seem to be any difference, or customers don't seem to favor more animal welfare over environmental sustainability claims, over organic, over plant-based, over social responsible, that the sustainability claim itself doesn't matter, but that the expectation is that it's there, and where it's there, the purchaser is anxious to be seen to purchase. And there's also a bit of research now that says consumers are happy to be more loyal to brands that are making those types of messages. So, I think headwinds wise, whether you're being pushed or being pulled, they're definitely in favor of greater attention being paid to whatever the leg of the sustainability stool an
Yeah.
organization might be interested in.
No, I think that resonates with what we're hearing as well from a lot of the practice members. So, for example, it's almost become a compelling competitive advantage from a recruitment and retention point of view. It's certainly thematic that we're hearing back that when questions are being asked by potential candidates,
Yeah,
they're very much around that whole area of environmental, social, and governance in terms of how, that old Cunard, how this is how we do things around here and how do you do them.
yeah,
And it actually can be a differentiator, and it's certainly become one that the recruiters are very much focusing on. And that whole kind of morph from CSR into ESG into, I suppose, where the rubber hits the road, and CSRD and so on, where it's getting very kind of granular. And I suppose to that point, I mean, companies are only as good as their people, and that piece that empowering employees, which we saw that wellness kind of trend coming out from COVID and the work from home environment and so on,
yeah.
and the virtual working, and there's a lot of benefits to that. So, I mean, again, maybe just to tease that out a little bit in terms of practice, I mean, how are you seeing companies motivating their employees to contribute to, I suppose, sustainability goals? What are you seeing in terms of innovation there, the programs outside of the old standard ones where they would all, for example, the amount of entities we would have seen on the Darkness into Light over the weekend is
Yeah,
an extraordinarily powerful thing, or the cancer day in terms of Daffodil Day as well. People get behind these things, but they are almost become part of the cultural wallpaper, if you want to
yeah.
call it that, in very correct and proper fashion. They're absolutely to be supported and admired. But what do
Yeah.
you see in terms of the innovation kind of in that space?
Um, there are lots of interesting examples that I've come across. We focus quite a bit on the notion of creating shared value, which
Okay.
is again, focused in on matching up the economic sustainability with either environment or social in some very meaningful way. And you've mentioned now in a couple of your mentions there is CSR, corporate social responsibility. And I think there's a trick being missed, in over focus on CSR without doing a bit more strategic thinking around how, with the same efforts we put into our corporate, social responsibility types of projects, that perhaps we could be a bit more strategic in term, organizations could be a bit more strategic about making those contributions in a way that doesn't hit a separate social goal, but hits a social goal that, is part and parcel vital for delivering strategy. Or maybe it's not the social goal that makes more sense. Maybe it's a piece of the environmental puzzle.
Do you mean
But
like
not,
community gain specifically kind of targeted, but it's in alignment with the strategy, but it's geographically bounded?
that would be one way of doing it for sure. And I guess we can see pockets of that in, I mean, we could call out
Energy?
supermarkets, local impacts, and so on. I think a lot of them might fall into the CSR category to an extent, but when you think about community building, well, then you say, yes, this is bigger than just doing something for a box ticking exercise. So yeah, I think community building would be a really good example of that. And I've had some interesting interactions again now with some of my some of the people in different classes at executive level. I'm thinking of one advanced practitioner group in particular, and we were talking about this issue about CSV, and we moved the conversation very nicely away from kind of airy-fairy sort of, sure, we need to be in business, we need to make money, we don't have time for this other stuff. And yet when they were pushed to actually put a very small project together,
Sure.
the feedback came back in very interesting ways about things that they were already doing or about angles that they hadn't seen before. I had a local large pharma person telling us about how they were very careful in focusing on the waste management of their canteens, how they had developed apps focusing on the reduction of food waste. And there was an explicit goal in the strategy about minimizing environmental impact of their products and supply. So, they were fitting very clearly into that, not just in a box ticking, but in a very measurable way as well. And I think that's one way of getting a sense check on, are we just doing something for the sake of doing it well, or are we doing something and in doing it, we're monitoring it and reporting on it to say that, yes, we are making a contribution to the strategy and the bottom line. So you can
Yeah, I
hit.
mean, that makes perfect sense. And I suppose to your point in terms of that, then, maybe to tease that out a little bit, in terms of engaging with shareholders and more so kind of stakeholders in the broader sense, what are you seeing in terms of the positive values or benefits in doing that properly? We've seen, historically in Ireland, I suppose that really kind of found its expression during the issue of the wind farms back about 20 years ago, when that kind of conversation started, and the whole town halls and the way it was and wasn't handled, and obviously up in North Mayo and some of the big ticket energy issues and the way they were handled, and retrospectively could have been handled differently. So that, I suppose, those lessons that have been learned in terms of stakeholder engagement and the real value of mapping that out from the get-go and kind of doing it in an appropriate, meaningful fashion without kind of greenwashing it.
Yes.
What are you seeing there in terms of the progress over the years?
At different sorts of levels, there are different types of examples, and to a large extent, I think maybe small local businesses have it easier. And I'm thinking of one precision engineering company who worked on a project there and was explaining to me that because they were sufficiently profitable, it really was a no-brainer when it came to discussing, new energy solutions. When they looked at the savings from, putting in the solar panels, and when they looked at the benefit from the heat recovery system, and they were in that mindset, yes, they were profitable. Yes, they were, more than a going concern. Yes, they saw themselves as being in business almost in perpetuity, the way they were talking about it. It was just the right thing to do, So the notion of the shareholder there, of course, it made perfect sense to keep investing given the savings. So that notion of the time frame, I think, is hugely important, and will allow some of those decisions about investment versus cost to be non-problematic. Internationally, I think it's more problematic, or if we think in terms of some of the bigger, larger commercial organizations, and again, just in terms of some of the teaching, we look at the case of UPS, the delivery company in the States, and so on, and clearly energy and fuel efficiency and so on is of great interest to them. And theoretically, they seem to have done everything that you might expect them to do, or you would advise them to do. They've done their stakeholder engagement. They've gone through rounds of processes of looking at materiality, trying to figure out what are the real issues that are material that they will not only need to disclose, but obviously that comes into it. But what are those issues really that matter for their bottom line, and who do they matter most for across the whole map of stakeholders, including shareholders? And they've done all that, and they create these lovely pictures in terms of the materiality matrix, and you see what matters, and that's fine. And of course, energy and so on is up there in the top right quadrant, and yet when it comes to being able to report in any meaningful way, they're not following through with science-based targets, to the extent that in the last two rounds of meetings with shareholders, there have been proposals that, of course, you should be doing that. But on the first occasion where that proposal went before the shareholders, it got 28% support. The following year, it only got 20% support. So I think, that notion of pay us now, keep the bucks rolling now, as opposed to that longer term, that's an enormous issue for large commercial concerns.
Yeah, but I think there could be a little bit of that famous fear and greed kind of element, which that matrix which you see. We're coming out of COVID. We're in a European war for all intents and purposes. We didn't think we'd see that in our lifetime.
Yeah.
The Middle East is very volatile at the moment, unfortunately, and the Far East is concerning in terms of the tectonic plates and how they move. And you can see the price of gold, which is probably the bellwether in these affairs. I suspect people are probably looking from a short-term perspective in terms of mitigating risk, and cash is king. My gut feeling, rightly or wrongly, and it's totally personal, would be that I suspect when you bake that cake with all those ingredients at the current moment, over the last 36 months, we have seen probably more evolution and challenge and concern being generated over the last 36 months coming out of the back of COVID than we've seen since the Balkan Wars. We haven't seen this level of kind of intensity going back for quite a few years. And I suspect that, there would be that mood of from a shareholder point of view to take the profit now because the uncertainty levels are so high. But I'd be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, no, all of that makes perfect sense, and yet, coming out of COVID, a company like UPS would have benefited enormously, in terms of the increase in deliveries, in terms of the impact on their balance sheet and so on. So I think, the alternative is possible as well, to imagine, yes, it now makes sense to actually invest in a lot more electric and so on and so forth. And I suppose, to a large extent, you do have that European versus US gap, which I think is still very evident. We had a visiting prof here from Dominican University, California for the last teaching term. And we had some interesting discussions. We can assume, again, with our local or even European view, that the take on sustainability and climate, is the one that we might have. That's not widely shared either. And again, that might be a potential in terms of, thinking strategically. I think Europe is still ahead in many ways in terms of thinking about how to strategize and how to leverage and how to benefit. in the sustainability space that can, perhaps create opportunities. It might only be first mover advantage, but there you are. That's something that can be beneficial for whatever period of time it's manifest.
And I mean, Eleanor, that speaks to a subject so close to your heart, and it very much kind of bakes into that in terms of strategy and strategic integration, which you just mentioned. I mean, that whole kind of the importance of those roadmaps, and they've gone from, I suppose, when I was a mere pup doing this sort of stuff, an MBA many years ago was a 5-year plan was the benchmark. It's now gone to 3 year at most. That's the kind of the long term almost.
Yeah.
And after COVID, you're actually looking kind of first point of contact. It's kind of tactically been evolved the whole time in terms
Mm.
of strategies. That word agile came into the I suppose the frame, the lexicon from a strategic point of view, agile strategy and
Yeah.
integration. So I mean, this is your meat and veg. This is your area of particular specialty. It would be remiss of me not to seek your wisdom in terms of maybe some examples of some companies that you've seen. Well, we're talking about sustainability, but sustainability in terms of the conversation we're having here in terms of the bottom line. One would have always assumed that was an imperative in terms of strategy, but now you've also got that ESG or that other element of it as well. So how do you bake that cake, if I use that expression again this morning, in terms of what are
Yeah.
you seeing out there in terms of stuff that resonates with you in that piece, or maybe real world challenges, or indeed success stories?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to unpick there now, because I think we still teach a lot of strategy. We talk a lot of strategy, but effectively, I think that again, it is always a discussion point. Strategy is developed to be put on the shelf, and then we go off and do our day-to-day business. Um, but I think it's as much an issue now. It's probably even a bigger issue, that difference between the day-to-day activity and getting on with what needs to be done, and what the purpose of what a strategy is about. I
Yeah.
think that gap is enormous now.
Yeah, that
Uh,
principle doesn't exist anymore in terms of boards that we would see. I think it had gone from 80/20 to 50/50, and I think it's converse now because it's so agile and it's moving so fast.
yeah, yeah, and I mean that it probably makes a lot of sense. You've got the shorter tenure of the CEO. You've got we're told that even though the largest companies are spending less and less time in those top lists, we're seeing the development of the platform economy, where the winner gets all, not even most anymore. We have very different type of structure, so it's hard to it's hard to identify, I think, wood from the trees in all of that. And yet we still teach strategy. We still argue, your strategic focus. It's not about what you're doing day to day. It's about what you're trying to do to differentiate yourself, to create this,
Mm.
blue ocean, or whatever um, metaphors and analogies we use. Um, and I'm actually slow enough to call out, big success stories for that very reason, because the probability of being successful, um, it's as large as it ever was, but the amount of time that any company is going to be able to lead and hold a very strong position for is entirely questionable. It's getting shorter and shorter. We've got these discovery for me in terms of the integration of the technology and a proprietary database of information that it developed over time, that makes it very difficult for anyone to compete with it, really, in the markets where it becomes substantial. It's a very different landscape, even from everything that I would have learned in terms of structure of economies and structure of industry and so on. But again, having said all that, when I went back into the classroom, and when I spoke to people in the coal face, they were
Mm.
still able to come up with examples of where sustainability projects seem to be very well aligned with what they were doing. And again, I'm thinking of a pharma company that came to the Midlands, And it was interesting how it came to the Midlands, a multinational plant from a country where it had been decided the human resources essentially had been exhausted. And where do they come? They come to Ireland, where, like, you know, our story I would have thought was quite similar. But the 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 base in the Midlands wouldn't have been in a city.
Mm.
People are attracted by different things. And in order to make their community even more attractive for more businesses interested in pharma, their notion about becoming economically sustainable, they thought their product, you know, the market offering was sustainable, not only because it's going to be patented for a while, but for other reasons as well. But they went down the route of, well, we need to grow our complement of qualified people. So their projects are really around engaging with other businesses in life sciences and pharma to grow the local provision of different types of training offers, you know, at all different types of levels, but up to and including, you know, university qualifications.
Okay.
And a group of people across organizations are doing that in a way, again, actually, that focuses on impacts that are cross community, cross business, you know, cross industry. They're doing it in an organized, structured way so that they're thinking beyond their own company, and, you know, that there would be a footprint for pharma as it currently is now, but for, you know, developing a stream of educated workforce that will be available and make it attractive. And you know, all of the positives are there. You're not living in a big city. You're not, you know, living with congestion. You're not maybe contributing in a different way to your communities and so on and so forth.
But
So
they're still in quality of life almost at that point in terms of
yeah,
the quid
yeah,
pro quo as part of that kind of exercise. So they're making a conscious decision. It's like the Western Development Commission, whose kind of ethos is very much to bring those sort of organizations over to the West, or the, you know, the
yes,
West of Ireland, and similarly to the Southwest.
yeah. Except this was nice because it was bottom up. I mean, a lot of those top down initiatives are great, but
Yeah.
unless the two meet, then, you know, with all the best will in the world, the impact, I think, is not the same when it's bottom up. And if that can be harnessed, I think that has a lot more going for it. You're, you know, you're not looking to ignite something. You're looking to grow something that's already there. You know.
I'm reminded of the cooperative societies when
Yeah,
they started their business. That model actually, if you were to translate it into the modern lexicon, that's exactly what they were about.
yeah, yeah. I have a Kerry
Sure.
colleague who, you know, talks to me about the metal, and it's all those types of approaches.
Yeah.
And again, you know, I think in Ireland we're still sufficiently not that far away from our co-op, from our agriculture, from our community roots, that so many of those things make perfect sense. You know, it's a question of kind of trying to help them, encourage them a little, rather than, you know, lots of big things that might have impact. Well, lots of small things have impact as well, you know. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I remember a couple of years ago in the West where I saw a small community, well, not a reasonable sized community to that end about the metal. They introduced kind of a barter structure, and the actual currency was metals.
yes,
Uh, it could very well still be going, but it particularly for services and so on. I remember some of the professional services, small accountants and stuff like that were getting
yeah,
involved as well.
yeah,
And it
yeah,
actually worked reasonably well within the context of that small geographic boundary, and people were quite comfortable with it. And it seemed to kind of make perfect sense when you actually explored it and had a chat with them about it.
yeah, yeah,
It would be remiss of me, Eleanor, as well, I suppose, as we are by definition management consultants, and we are practical people at the end of the day, and always looking at the next big Uber trend that's coming down the tracks at us. Not to throw the Lee Roddy in and ask you about kind of AI, and where you see that in terms of the future from a strategic point of view, or its applications, or what's your sense of it at the moment?
yeah, yeah. Um, I can be parochial about it and think in terms of the impact on education. And, you know, again, we have a mindset issue, I think, if you have, depending who you talk to in education, in terms of the threat of AI or the opportunity.
Yeah.
So we need to be a bit creative, I think, in terms of being fair about what the threats are, so that we, or the integrity of our examinations, for example, needs to be protected and so on. But even, simpler than that, the extent to which, compared to 20 years ago, you can get so much done, home office, just because of the different types of technologies that are integrated. Different type of sustainability impact of AI, I think that perhaps could be sold a bit more, is the impact for disability.
Okay.
And, there's such a substantial chunk of markets, consumers, that are impacted by different disabilities, where AI can be hugely helpful. I think there's a lot to be done there. Trivial examples, if you've managed to break your arm or something like that, and now you can dictate so much, you can, like, they are trivial, but they can be hugely impactful for the person who has
Absolutely, yeah.
the problem. And it's that notion of what problem are we trying to solve that AI can address. So I think those types of issues, underserved markets, it's a big part of the whole creating shared value story as well. Firms think about, who are we serving well, who are we not serving, and why are we not serving them? Are there technologies that would allow us to, kind of tilt a little rather than have to change substantially? I know there's going to be a lot of change, across different types of I'm thinking of our legal friends as well, but I really see the opening up of resources, where you can, hand over a lot of trivial things to AI, and the capacity to be more intelligent with our health resources. I mean, who doesn't want to have a better, faster diagnosis, that's able to compare not just local, national, but international information to, I think, yeah, I'm this is a mindset issue. I would definitely be someone more glass half full than half empty. So that's how I would tend to see all of these things, but they need to be realistic about the very real threats that they pose as well. But we're intelligent enough, I think, once we call them out, to try and sort them out as well.
Yeah, and I guess as well, it's just, I suppose, on steroids at the moment. It has been with us for a while. That evolution has been occurring, and it's actually stitched into a lot of the stuff we do. We just weren't as aware of it within the context of, we put expression on it by the term AI and chat GPT and stuff like that. It is interesting. I mean, we've had a few interesting conversations with colleagues of yours over the last kind of 6 months in terms of this space. And I suppose what's coming back to us is, from our professional point of view, that the path ahead really kind of will be uber niche. So that kind of area of specialty will become quite focused, and that's where the real value will be. And to your point about the general administrative elements and the use of tools, kind of to generate kind of, I suppose, better use of time and focus on kind of more material kind of feedback, and that uber niche piece will be interesting to see how it evolves over the period. But that's the general kind of feeling we're getting back from people who are looking at it more focused. Eleanor, it's been a wonderful conversation. We could talk all afternoon, but I know you're very busy as well, and you've given us of your time. I think we should probably draw to a close at this point. We don't any questions that are coming in, we'll pop them in to you afterwards. You've kindly said you might get a chance to reflect on them. And again, I popped it into the chat that we're having another module, one of your colleagues from Maynooth University, Jean Cushion, next week as well, kind of on that whole kind of sustainability supply chain area as well, which will be interesting. Interesting is my buzzword, obviously, today. It's all very interesting. But to that end, Gurmila Mahagat, I've really enjoyed the chat with you. I've listened to what you said, and you've actually shared very deeply some of the stuff that we've been kind of kicking around ourselves. And it's really helpful sometimes just to find expression in a conversation so eloquently put as you did this afternoon. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you. Look forward to having a cup of coffee with you in due course down in Cork. And in the meantime, we'll allow you to get back to a cup of soup or whatever you have available to you. And we'll leave it at that. All right. Slán go fóill.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks.
God bless.